Hello and welcome to another video from the only source of information that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the fourth in my Melchizedek video series. We are not going to be able to fully understand the significance of the role that Melchizedek played unless we first understand who it was that opposed his position as rightful king over the earth. In the beginning, the earth was spoiled by those who opposed God. As Genesis chapter 6 and verses 11 through 13 describes a situation, the earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. In Noah's day, those ruining God's creation were referred to in the original Hebrew language of the Bible as Nephilim. Theologians have been debating over the identity of these beings for thousands of years without ever being able to conclusively determine who they were. Fortunately for us, as we approach the last days, God has revealed precisely who they are, and by the end of this video, you'll know more about the Nephilim than anyone else alive on the earth. To anyone reading the Bible, it is undeniable that from the very beginning, the subject of race or ethnicity seems to have been a big issue. The way that the Bible carefully records family lines and the way that God separated the Israelites from the Egyptians and then later separated the Israelites from the Canaanites makes it seem obvious that something significant involving lineage had to have been involved. Even the nation of Israel itself was divided up according to family lineage. Each of the 12 family lines was given very distinct areas of the promised land to inhabit once their 40-year journey was completed. Those 12 family lines being based on the family of the 12 sons of Jacob. In one way or another, all of the information in this series relates to why those divisions are so important to people, but so insignificant to God. Today's video is going to focus primarily on identifying a group that in the ancient Hebrew language are called Nephilim. Those individuals that, depending on what version of the Bible you are reading, may be called giants. Obviously, to anyone with a pure heart and the capacity to think things through, there is no way that our Creator could possibly love one race of man more than another. If God truly had a race that He preferred over the others, then logically, as the Creator, it would have been within His means to simply not have created the ones that He didn't like to begin with. But it is also obvious that the vast majority of human beings do not have pure hearts, nor do they have the capacity to think things through. To a racist, every verse having anything to do with the separating of the tribes of man becomes an excuse for hatred. To a racist, every verse having anything to do with God's chosen people is perceived as proof that those who are not chosen are not as loved as those who are. And somehow, every racist familiar with the Bible believes that it is their race that is the one God approves of. As I go through the verses that prove that God does not have a preference for any particular race of mankind, most of the teachings of the race-based religions will be overturned. The verses that say that God loves all of us and that we are all to love one another are impossible to miss, easy to understand, and obvious. The Bible verses that are used to support the claims of those who believe in racial purity never really seem to support any kind of separation of the races as a means of pleasing God, at least not in any solid way that we would want to base our faith on. Such passages are often difficult to understand, but even if we carefully study each word of each verse, we would never be able to associate those verses with any kind of racial purity agenda. Those who believe that the Bible supports racial purity have to have been taught to do so. No one would ever be able to come to such a conclusion simply by reading the Bible. But there is a particular line of reasoning associated with something called the serpent seed doctrine that, at least on the surface, seems to actually have the support of the Scriptures. If you have ever seen anything posted about the serpent seed, then you are likely already familiar with some of the information that I am about to share with you. According to the Bible, Eve was told that she could eat fruit from every tree that was in the garden, with the exception of a single tree that has become known as the tree of knowledge of good and bad. According to the serpent seed doctrine, this fruit was not a literal fruit, but a euphemism for sexual intercourse. If you follow the line of reasoning that is used to support the serpent seed teaching, then you will pick up on the fact that much of what these people believe makes much more sense than what is taught by the traditional religions. The activities of mankind on this earth for nearly 6,000 years are so horrible that many simply cannot accept that those perpetrating such acts can be genetically similar to themselves. It would be very easy to simply accept the serpent seed doctrine as truth, were it not for the fact that every race of man, and every nation of man, and every blood type of man has been directly involved in every atrocity of man. Since none of us who has had experience with religion wants to be drawn back into the same trap under a different name, we must remain cautious about becoming too involved with any group of people that requires us to believe in some kind of doctrine that is not easy to perceive in the world around us with our own eyes, or that is not clearly spelled out in the ancient text that have been given to mankind by God. A very important first step in figuring out who the Nephilim are came to me while studying the 10 Commandments. I knew from reading the Bible that God's law never changes, and yet I also knew that the law given to Adam and Eve was not like the law given to Moses. Bible passages that are found at Numbers chapter 23 and verse 19, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8, and James chapter 1 and verse 17 all confirm that the true God's standards do not change. After researching each and every word of the 10 Commandments, I posted a video about just that subject. After studying the commandment found at Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14 and comparing it to the commandment found at Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17, I could see that those two commandments had almost nothing to do with what I had been led to believe by the churches. Thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife. Even before looking into the ancient Hebrew words used at these verses, I could see that these two commandments, as understood in English, obviously contradicted the lifestyles of men like Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and David, who are spoken of throughout the Bible as being good examples for us to follow. Each of these men had multiple sex partners. Their relationships with these women are openly and honestly recorded in the Bible. And never once was there anything condemnatory recorded anywhere in the Bible about those relationships. Very obviously, the words found in the Ten Commandments that we translate into our English words adultery and wife could not possibly be anything like our modern concept of what is adultery and what is a wife. Otherwise, these righteous men would not have been written about in such a positive way. Throughout the Bible, slavery is strictly prohibited. It is often difficult to see just how much God hates slavery from reading an English translation of the Bible, but in the original languages it is obvious. I have produced several videos addressing this issue. In any case, most of what God hates about slavery would define our modern concept of marriage. It is obvious that humans were designed to fall in love. In most human sexual interactions, romance is involved. It is also obvious that God intended children to have fathers and mothers. But it should also be obvious to anyone studying the Bible that God never gave humans the right to own other humans. The concept of coveting another man's material possessions, livestock, wives, and children had to be about more than just human sexuality. The Hebrew word that is translated as adultery is neaph, Strong's H5003. Neaph is used throughout the Old Testament and in quite a few instances obviously means to somehow interact with the gods. The only way to harmonize the two concepts expressed by these two commandments would require thinking of the gods as somehow different, a race of beings that did not have the right to claim ownership of humanity, a race of beings that was somehow different. Since the Ten Commandments were obviously not given to the gods but to Moses and the Israelites, I knew that it would be difficult to prove what I am talking about. Over time, these commandments became understood as we understand them today, for a reason. One of the first verses alluding to covetousness and adultery seemingly is recorded at Genesis chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4. It is these verses that lend the strongest support for the serpent seed teaching. And it came to pass when humans began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, the men of renown. Although I had never fully understood these verses until I forced myself to sit down and examine each and every word, I always had a basic understanding that these Nephilim were somehow involved in most of mankind's problems prior to the flood of Noah's day. I also understood that those Nephilim were born as a result of those sons of God having sex with women. And I was 100% right about that. But having spent my entire life involved with human religions, I had acquired a few beliefs that were not at all correct. For many years, I knew in my heart that those sons of God were powerful spirit beings who came down from heaven to have sexual relations with fleshly mortals. I had heard as much from several Protestants over the years and had seen an artist rendering of the sons of God staring down from the clouds at some very attractive young ladies apparently planning their next move. Back at that time, I never even thought about trying to research whether or not the religions of man knew what they were talking about. I simply accepted that they were sharing some spiritual truth that someone, somewhere, at some time had discovered as they were researching these verses for themselves. As much as I believed that these sons of God were some kind of spirit beings, I eventually had to admit that I was wrong. Perhaps after Christ's return, we will come to understand so much that we will wonder how we could have ever been so ignorant. But even now, using nothing more than the Bible, we can know much more than those who are involved in religion. In fact, a very important first step that I always try to highlight for people wanting to learn any spiritual truth is just how essential it is to separate ourselves from whatever belief system we may currently be involved in. Figuring out any ancient mystery while studying nothing more than the truth is difficult enough. Attempting to do so while at the same time allowing ourselves to be exposed to religious doctrine would likely be impossible. You cannot improve your health with vitamins if you wash them down with poison. In speaking of the sons of God, Job chapter 2 and verse 1 says this: "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came to present himself before the Lord." Just this short piece of text reveals quite a bit about who these sons of God were. First off, the fact that the phrase sons of God is plural means that there had to have been more than one. But if we take into consideration that Satan came in with them in order to present himself before the Lord, just as those sons of God had come in to present themselves before the Lord, there is a pretty good possibility that Satan himself may have been one of those sons of God. Linguistically, it would at least seem that this is a possibility, but maybe not. In the creation account, Satan is called a serpent. His title of serpent may have been figurative. However, it is equally possible that it may have been literal. I won't be debating the physical nature of Satan because I simply do not know. The serpent actually spoke to Eve. Had I ever witnessed a serpent speaking with a human, I would say that certainly Satan was a serpent. But I have never seen such a thing. The conversation between Satan and Eve took place thousands of years before the languages were confused at the Tower of Babel. So there is the possibility that Satan was in fact a serpent. However, if Satan was in fact a literal serpent, that would not necessarily exclude him from being a literal son of God as well, as you're about to find out. To anybody reading this verse and other similar verses, these sons of God might seem to be spirits, likely the same spirit being spoken of in other verses as angels. Many religions teach that these sons of God, in fact, are spirits, and many accept this information as fact. Most of us would never suspect the churches of having any reason to lie about such a thing. But since that information isn't clearly spelled out in the Bible, we shouldn't just take the churches at their word. All religions are made up of religious people, and religious people have a very bad reputation for being dishonest. If we are willing to ignore the teachings of religion and just concentrate on what is recorded in the Bible, we can get a much better understanding of just who these sons of God were. If we look at every verse about a son of God, we should be able to at least get a basic understanding of what a son of God is, or what a son of God is not. Jesus, who was a fleshly man, is often spoken of as the Son of God. That doesn't necessarily mean that all sons of God are fleshly beings, but at least we can confirm that a son of God doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of invisible spirit creature. Another son of God that confirms that this is the case is Adam. At Luke chapter 3 and verse 38, Adam is called the Son of God. Many religious people deny that Adam was a son of God in the same way that Jesus was a son of God, but linguistically, the Bible speaks of Adam, Jesus, those gathered before God in the book of Job, and the fathers of the Nephilim in exactly the same way. Knowing that God's Word, the Bible, makes no distinction, indicates that as different as each of these sons of God may have been, they had to have shared some common traits. At the very least, we can know that each of them had the same Father in some unique way. That Father being God. There can be no denying that Jesus was obviously different from every other character in the Bible. Many, if not all, of Christianity's conflicting sects recognize that Jesus' role makes him the focus of the Bible narrative. This obvious fact has led many of Christendom's religions to adopt the doctrine that Jesus is in fact God Almighty Himself. Many adherents of the cults of man cannot accept that the title Son of God can properly be assigned to anyone other than Jesus. As obvious as it might be that the title Son of God is not unique to Jesus, the religions of Christianity still attempt to make an artificial distinction where one simply does not exist. When speaking of Adam as an ancestor of Jesus, most English versions of Luke chapter 3 and verse 38 say, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the Son of God. In the original Greek, the actual words used here would translate literally as of Enosh, of Seth, of Adam, of God. If you notice, in Greek, the word son is not actually present in this verse. The churches teach that Adam was a sinner and Jesus was not. So the official teaching of some churches highlight the missing word son at this verse as evidence to support that Adam would not qualify for the official title Son of God, in the same way that many religions try to say that Satan was not a son of God, as if Satan had a different creator or perhaps created himself. This list runs all the way from verse 23 to 38, but it is all just part of a single thought. It is obvious that everyone on the list is the father of the previous person on the list. This very long sentence begins by making the curious statement that people thought that Jesus was the son of Joseph. At this verse, the word huios, Strong's G5207, is used. Huios means child, and in context could properly be translated as son due to the fact that everyone on the list is male. In other words, technically, verses 23 and 24 say that Jesus was thought to be a child of Joseph, of Heli, of Mathat, etc. Huios is the same Greek word that is used in the phrases Son of Man and Son of God, meaning that as recorded in Greek, it would be more accurate to call Jesus child of mankind and child of God. The Hebrew word ben that I spoke of earlier would also be more accurately translated as child. Although it's obvious that the word huios, or child, is not present anywhere with the exception of the very first verse in this sentence, it is a well-known fact that in Attic Greek, the word son would be understood at each use of the word of, which is an accurate translation of the Greek word tau, Strong's G3588. What is recorded in the Bible is reasonable. What is taught by religion is not. Other verses confirm that people would have likely thought that Joseph was Jesus' father. After all, Jesus was born in Joseph's house to Mary, who was also a member of Joseph's house. Adam was created directly by God, so it should be obvious that Adam was a child of God. Adam had no human father or mother. Hopefully, addressing the language used to describe Adam as a son of God will mitigate much of the religious foolishness that is normally directed towards me whenever I make one of these videos. It would only be logical to think of Adam as a fleshly being just like us. There is nothing to lead us to believe that Adam was some kind of invisible spirit creature. Jesus, at least during his time among mankind in the first century, was also a fleshly being. Although there is some debate about where he was and what form he was in prior to his birth, and what form he took after his resurrection. Now we have to determine what kind of creatures the sons of God were in Genesis chapter 6 and verses 4 and 5. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. They were the famous heroes of antiquity, and the Lord saw that humans were very wicked on the earth, and every intention of mankind's heart was only bad all of the time. When people say to me that the Nephilim somehow survived the flood, or that the Nephilim were giants, or that the Nephilim were killed off when the sons of Israel entered the promised land, I usually just keep quiet. People want details about things that they cannot possibly understand without at least a basic understanding of what the Bible actually says. Today is the day for making that basic understanding available to everyone. In this video series, I will be revealing many things that the churches have been successfully concealing for thousands of years. The information that I am sharing with you today will include everything that a person needs to know about the Nephilim. When you are finished listening to all of the information in this series, you will know more about the Bible than has been known by anyone in at least the last 2,000 years. I am reasonably sure that everything that we need to know is recorded in just Genesis chapter 6 and verses 4 and 5. The word that is rendered as Nephilim, Nephil, Strong's H5303, actually means fellers. In our day, men who cut down trees might be called fellers. In Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 8, the Bible says that after Satan is removed from the earth, the trees will rejoice, saying, "Now that you are gone, no one comes to cut us down." It should be obvious to anyone reading this verse that the cutting down of the Creator's trees would have been enough of a sin in and of itself to cause our Father to refer to those doing the cutting as wicked. According to this verse, it was Satan that caused people to cut down trees. And once he is gone, the current practice of doing harm to God's forest will cease forever. I have heard religious doctrines that specifically state that Nephilim means fellers of men. In other words, murderers. Some Bible translations do not use the word Nephilim at this verse, but instead render this word as giants. The religious belief that giants once roamed the earth is so great that any time someone uploads a photoshopped picture of archaeologists unearthing a fossilized giant skeleton, it gets shared millions of times on social media as authentic. There is no linguistic connection between the ancient Hebrew word translated as Nephilim and any ancient Hebrew word related to unusual height. That doesn't mean that these Nephilim weren't giants. It just means that there is no evidence for such a belief found in the Bible. Simply put, the Hebrew word Nephil means feller. I think that the word Nephilim could easily mean a feller of anything, plant, animal, fish, bird, or tree. After all, each of these living things belongs to God just as the trees do. God entrusted mankind with the very special privilege of being responsible caretakers of His planet. And it should be obvious to any reasonable person that mankind in general has betrayed that trust. That being the case, it is more than possible that Nephilim or fellers is simply a title earned for causing the destruction of any of God's living things. Some reference materials state that the word Nephil means fallen. In other words, these Nephilim did not cause others to fall, but instead fell themselves. Often it is implied that they fell from heaven or fell from grace. But that seems very illogical when we take into consideration how the Hebrew language works. In Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 12, the Bible uses the Hebrew word that means fallen. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? It is the ancient Hebrew word naphal, Strong's H5037, that is translated as our English word fallen at this verse. Nephal appears in the ancient Hebrew text of the Bible a total of 434 times. Nephal and Nephil are obviously very similar, which is what we would expect. But they are also very different, especially as originally rendered in ancient Hebrew. At each verse where the Hebrew word nephal is used, the concept of the subject falling or being fallen or being cast down or even submitting to a more powerful being is undeniable. But in every piece of text that includes the word nephil, it is obvious that none of the persons that the word is used to describe is being accused of falling, but instead of causing others to fall. In fact, even outside of the Bible, the word nephil is only used to denote those who cause living things to fall. As Strong's exhaustive concordance brings out, in the Chaldean language, the word nephil has been found in ancient Babylonian text about the nephil or giant in the sky. In particular, the giant that we today call constellation Orion. There is no ambiguity about the identity of Orion. Orion the hunter is absolutely without a doubt the same individual that the Bible calls Nimrod the hunter. It is pretty much universally accepted by every authority on the ancient past that the two are one and the same. Nimrod was born after the flood. His father was Cush, the natural son of Ham, who was obviously a human. His mother was also a human, and yet according to external sources, he was memorialized for all posterity as the Nephilim constellation. Obviously, constellation Orion is very large, but that does not mean that Orion the man, also known as Nimrod, was any larger than his peers. This constellation was not named after Orion because he fell, but because he caused others to fall. It has been pointed out to me many times by my viewers that giants such as Goliath and Og were Nephilim. But within the pages of the Bible, there really is no linguistic connection whatsoever between such men and the word Nephilim. I am not saying that Goliath and Og were not fellers, but singling them out as such would be unfair. Their reputations as great heroes of the ancient past are fairly inconsequential when compared to other Bible characters who were never described as unusually tall, such as Nimrod. According to the Bible, the very first king chosen by the nation of Israel was Saul. Saul was not chosen to be king by God, but according to the account, God allowed Saul to be king because the Israelites demanded it. According to 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, Saul was every bit as tall as Goliath and Og. Kish had a son named Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a handsomer man found in all of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. I am 6'3", which is rather tall, but not freakishly so. If we figure that quite a few people in Israel were probably the same height as myself, or likely much taller, and add another 12 inches to cover the extra height of Saul from his shoulders upwards, then Saul would have been at least 7'3" tall. I'm not making this up. 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1 really is in the Bible. The description of Saul's height means that he was likely as tall as Goliath and Og. It should be obvious that Saul was likely chosen by the people because of his height. Many today who are unusually tall are admired for this very insignificant characteristic. Perhaps the surrounding nations all had unusually tall rulers. If that is the case, it is possible that those that are called Nephilim in the Bible were all very tall. But without any information recorded in our Bibles to confirm such a thing, the belief that the Nephilim were giants can never be anything more than a religious doctrine. Those who believe that the Nephilim survived the flood say that Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33 clearly states that there were Nephilim in the promised land long after the flood. But in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 32, the verse just before that, the Bible says that the report about the Nephilim was a lie. Most Bibles say that the report was evil, but the Hebrew word used is not the word meaning evil. It is debah, Strong's H1681, which means lie. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4 says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. Some argue that the Nephilim were never done away with, while others say that they were done away with at the flood. Linguistically, both could be correct. As worded, this verse does not definitively explain exactly what happened, nor does it define the length of time that would be understood by the words also after. Some English translations of the Bible incorporate the thought of the Nephilim's time on the earth as being limited into their literal translations. The New Living Translation says that the Nephilim were in those days and for some time afterwards. The International Standard Version says the Nephilim were on the earth at that time and also immediately afterward. The God's Word translation says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also later. I'm only telling you this so that you can understand that there is some debate among translators as to the precise length of time indicated by the original wording. It is likely that the translators simply rendered the verse in whatever way best suits the doctrinal beliefs of whichever religion is sponsoring their translations. I believe that much of the disagreement concerning the length of time that the Nephilim existed on the earth is probably based on the fact that if we acknowledge that the Nephilim are still here, then we have to somehow identify just who they are. Since all Bible translators are certified directly by the state through the university system of degrees and work directly for the religions of the empire, they are not likely to produce anything that would expose just who the Nephilim are, if in fact the Nephilim are still around. Especially if the Nephilim are an essential part of the empire that they represent. Perhaps God had this information recorded in this way so that only truth seekers would be able to understand who the Nephilim are and why they must be done away with. If the Nephilim continued to live after the flood, the Babylonian belief that Nimrod was a Nephilim would be accurate. Even the claims of the spies sent out by Moses may have been correct. The Bible calls those spies liars, but it doesn't actually tell us which part of their report was the lie. We're going to have to go much deeper than the cults of Christianity and Judaism if we want to come to an accurate understanding of what is meant by the wording of these verses. Calling the Nephilim famous heroes is more accurate than calling them men of renown or famous men of old, as most English translations of the Bible traditionally do. The word Enaush, Strong's H582, which is found at this verse, might be better translated in some other way. According to most Hebrew reference materials, the word can only mean human men, but that is not how the word is used in the Bible. At Genesis chapter 19 and verse 1, the Bible says that two angels visited Lot in Sodom. At Genesis chapter 18 and verse 2, these same angels are called Enaush. If we read further in the account, we're told that the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house in an attempt to abduct these angels. This is found at Genesis chapter 19 and verse 4. But this time it is the men surrounding the house that are called Enaush. If in this one account both men and angels are called Enaush, then obviously Enaush cannot simply mean male humans, at least not as we currently think of angels. It is possible that both the men and the angels in this account are biologically humans in a fleshly form. If we refuse to believe that angels can exist in fleshly form, then it is likely that we have been trained to do so by religion. Religion, as we know it, is any belief system that people subscribe to that is not supported by provable facts. Nowhere in this account does the Bible specifically say that these angels were some kind of spirit creatures. Previously, these same angels had met with Abraham and eaten food, which is another indication that these angels were in fact fleshly beings. There really are not any scriptures that I can think of that clearly define what an Enaush is. Many verses about Enaush are obviously about named men, so we can know for a fact that an Enaush can be a man. But that doesn't mean that a woman cannot also be an Enaush. Just like the teaching that this word can only pertain to humans, the teaching that Enaush can only be male may be false as well. There is a word that can only be used to describe women, which is never used to describe men, that is formed from the word Enaush. That word is Aish Shah, Strong's H802. According to the teachings of religion, this word means wife and is made up of the two words Aish, which we are told means man, and Enaush, which we are told means man. The ancient Hebrew language is usually very logical, so we need to understand that something is not quite right with the current understanding of what this word means. There would be no logical connection between our modern concept of a wife and two Hebrew words, both meaning man. It simply does not make sense to define a wife as a man. I have posted many videos explaining that the word Aish has no English equivalent because it describes a position in society that is no longer part of our current social order. Aish means male tribal leader. Enaush means leader. Aish Shah can only mean leader of the male tribal leader. In other words, Throughout the Old Testament, the word tribal leader is never used when speaking of a woman, because women are always referred to specifically as leaders of the male tribal leaders. The word Aish Shah is used throughout the Hebrew portion of the Bible. The Hebrew title of Aish Shah is always assigned to women who were the sexual partners of very powerful men. In our culture, the wives of powerful rulers might be thought of as Aish Shah. But the word Aish Shah cannot simply be translated as wife, due to the fact that many men in our day who are married to wives would not be considered powerful according to Bible standards. But since very few people still live by tribal law, it could be said that every housewife is an Aish Shah, a leader of a male tribal leader. Another point that I think needs to be brought out is that the word Enaush, which means leader, is the root of the word Anash, Strong's H605. Anash means incurably sick. Hidden in the Bible account of the fall of mankind, there's a very direct connection between the words Enaush, meaning leader, and Anash, meaning terminally ill, which is brought out at Romans chapter 5 and verse 12. Sin came into the world through one human, and death through that sin. Hence, death spread to all humans because all sinned. If you look at this verse in any English version of the Bible, you will not see the word human, but the words man and men. Once again, translation errors are to blame. Many verses in the Bible similar to this verse seem to be about Adam bringing sin into the world. However, there are also verses like this that are very obviously about Eve bringing sin into the world. And there can be no denying that there are other verses about Satan bringing sin into the world. The actual word that is used here is the Greek word anthropos. Anthropos is where we get our English word anthropology, which means the study of humans, not the study of male humans. Mankind was promised by God that if obedient to His command to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, we would live forever. Satan told Eve that God was lying and that she would live forever, whether she ate of the fruit of the tree or not. But Satan also promised Eve that she could be like the gods. In other words, a leader. But it was not God that was lying. As John chapter 8 and verse 44 brings out, Satan was lying. Because as soon as Eve ate from the fruit, she became terminally ill, just as God had said. The fact that Eve is no longer among the living proves that what I am telling you is true. The moment that Eve ate of the fruit, she became both Enaush, a leader, and a Nash, terminally ill. The same could also be said about humanity in general. For a fact, according to the Bible, the root cause of human mortality is the perverted desire to be gods. In trying to determine if the sons of the true God were indeed spirit creatures or actually fleshly beings just like ourselves, I diligently searched the Scriptures for any passage that seemed to support the possibility that the sons of God were in fact some kind of beings that existed in the spirit realm. But I was unable to positively identify a single verse that seemed to support such a notion. Nowhere in the Bible are the word angel and the phrase Son of God used to describe the same individual. However, as I said earlier, the phrase Son of God is used to describe both Adam as a fleshly human being and Jesus, when he was alive on the earth, as a fleshly human being. Since Satan and Adam, who are both spoken of in the Bible as living within the Garden of Eden at the same time, it is only logical to conclude that each and every person spoken of as a son of God in the Bible was a created being made by God, without fleshly parents. At Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2, the phrase Son of God, as written in ancient Hebrew, is plural, meaning more than one. Job chapter 2 and verse 1 reveals that the sons of God, plural, came to present themselves before God, which once again means more than one son of God would have been present. And then it says that Satan came in among them, meaning that his presence would be added to those who would already be there. We cannot simply assume that Satan himself was a son of God based on the fact that he entered in among the sons of God, but it is possible. Similarly, we can't simply assume that there were more than two sons of God. Sons being plural simply means that there were more than one. But we do have to at least acknowledge that there were possibly more than two sons of God present, and that Satan himself may have been a son of God as well. If indeed Satan really was a serpent and not a man, he still could have been a son of God. The word that is translated at these verses as son is actually Ben, Strong's H1121, and according to Strong's exhaustive concordance, the ancient Hebrew word can be used to describe the children of humans or the children of animals. Since serpents would have been created by the same God that created humans, it could very well be that Satan was one of the first of his kind created directly by God, just as Adam and the other sons of God were created directly by God. In fact, it is possible that the verses about the sons of God are actually about all of the living things created directly by God. Up to this point, this entire video has been devoted to explaining some essential background information that is going to be useful in determining just who the Nephilim are. But if we simply go back and read the verses that are specifically about the Nephilim, we may possibly be able to figure out who they are without having to do any additional research at all. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1 says, when human beings began to reproduce. There is no confusion about what this means. Human beings had children. This is not about spirit creatures having children. It is specifically stated that these children were humans born of humans. As worded in English, there is some confusion about who had who, but that is easily cleared up simply by examining the original language text. According to our English language Bibles, men had daughters, but a more appropriate understanding of this verse would be men and women began to multiply. The excuse that translators use in explaining their rendering is based on the word that is translated as daughters of men. The Hebrew word bath, Strong's H1323, is made up of the two words banah, Strong's H1129, which means built, and ben, Strong's H1121, which means sons, or as I stated earlier, children. In other words, the phrase daughters of men would be more accurately translated as the women built from the humans created directly by God. If you think about it, this is a very good description of Eve. According to the creation account, Adam, the son or child of God, was created from the dust, and Eve was created from Adam. In effect, Eve was built from Adam. Since Eve was made from Adam's rib, it could be said that she was Adam's daughter. But since both were created by God, a more appropriate way of thinking of Adam and Eve would be as brother and sister. Within the pages of the Bible, the concept of brothers and sisters reproducing offspring is not unique to Adam and Eve. Since Adam and Eve would have been biologically similar, it would not be wrong to think of them as clones. But since they were of different genders, probably a better way to describe them would to be as twins. True clones would be identical in every way, including identical in gender. In our day, when close relatives reproduce, there is an increased risk of certain kinds of problems due to the fact that if both parents carry a particular genetic defect, it is more likely that their offspring will be affected by that defect. But far from absolute, many brothers and sisters over the course of history have reproduced healthy offspring. This even happens from time to time in our day. The only reason that I am mentioning this is because it is a common misconception that as brother and sister, Adam and Eve could not have reproduced healthy children together. Since all of the sons of God would have been genetically perfect without any defects at all, any offspring resulting from a mating of Adam and Eve would themselves have been perfect. Had Adam and Eve's offspring remained faithful to their race, every single descendant of theirs would likely, to this day, look exactly like Adam and Eve. Another very logical line of reasoning that cannot be denied is the fact that those daughters of men, those beings built out of the sons of God, as spoken of at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, are spoken of in the plural. Regardless of whether or not the verse at Job is about the entire animal kingdom, the verse at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4 is very clearly about multiple human sons of God. If each of those sons of God was genetically distinct from one another, but Adam was genetically identical to Eve, Eve having been created from his rib, we would expect that those other women would have been created in a similar way. In other words, each of the sons of God might have had a mate created from their ribs. I know that none of this is recorded in the Bible, but we have to recognize that there is no other explanation as to who these multiple sons of God were, and that there is no other explanation as to who these multiple women built out of men would have been. Another reason that we can believe that there were multiple races of man created and placed in the garden is that the story of creation, which is very limited, starts to make perfect sense once we compare what we know about the creation account with other stories containing similar details that are recorded in our Bibles. The two commandments of not to covet your neighbor's wife and not to commit adultery, as translated into English, would seemingly describe any sex act that might have taken place between Satan and Eve. But that is only as translated into English. Were the original Hebrew translated accurately, such a concept could not even exist. And as you are about to find out, the concept can't even exist in a modern translation when we take into consideration the entire text of the Bible. Some may believe, and rightfully so, that God's commands still stand to this day. Many people reading the verses involving the Nephilim believe that the mixing of angels and humans, or the mixing of the races, is the cause of much of the suffering that mankind has endured over the centuries. Very obviously, in our day, any commandments that people may imagine to be associated with the mixing of races would be impossible to observe. No area of the earth is currently inhabited by people that are identical in appearance. Each and every one of us is different from each and every other one of us, with the exception of those who just happen to be identical twins. But even in identical twins, there are significant differences. No matter how much time you devote to the study of the Scriptures, you will never find any indication that God has a special love for any particular nation, race, skin color, or blood type. obviously something else has to be involved. In the first century, when Jesus was here on the earth in the flesh, he said things that seemingly fit in very well with the serpent seed doctrine. At Matthew chapter 23 and verse 33, Jesus accused the teachers of the law and the Pharisees of being descendants of Satan. You snakes, you children of the serpent, how do you plan on avoiding the judgment of Gehenna? Jesus was very clearly associating those religious leaders with the serpent seed. However, nowhere in the Bible are we given any information that would help us to identify any kind of genetic trait that Jesus would have used to help him to determine that those Pharisees descended from Satan. If those Pharisees shared some kind of character trait, such as blood type or a similar skin color, we will probably never know. Using every bit of information that is recorded in the Bible, we can't even determine what color Jesus was. And contrary to what some religions teach, we certainly will never be able to determine his blood type. With every bit of information that is at our disposal, we can get a basic understanding of just who those Nephilim were that seemingly caused all of our problems. Those Nephilim are us. Kind of. Let's look at the verses that tell us about the Nephilim one more time, as found at Genesis chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass, when humans began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children of them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, the men of renown. Obviously, the time when humans began to multiply would have been shortly after humans were created. Linguistically, there isn't really any indication that the title of Nephilim was limited to the offspring of those sons of God. The Hebrew word Nephilim simply means fellers. Since those sons of God were alive when men began to make a name for themselves as fellers, even the sons of God would have qualified as Nephilim if they caused any of God's plants, animals, fish, birds, trees, or fellow human beings to die. Since the word Nephilim in this verse is associated with those who had a well-known reputation for killing living things, we can assume that this title, as used in this verse, was only being applied to those that were involved in the felling or killing of living things. In the Bible, Satan himself could be one of those accused of being an Nephilim. John chapter 8 and verse 44 says, Ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of the institution of lying. It could be said that Satan was a murderer because he caused Eve to lose her life, and by default all of us as well. But we don't know everything about Satan. It is possible that while in fleshly form, he eventually led military campaigns in his lust for power, directly engaging in carnal warfare, taking many human lives with his own hands. Cain himself may have been considered by God to be a Nephilim for the act of killing his brother. According to the serpent seed doctrine, the reason that Cain killed his brother was because Satan was Cain's biological father. Initially, I dismissed this teaching as utter nonsense. After all, I had always been told that Cain and Abel were brothers, having the same father and mother. But after discovering that much of what I had learned from religion over the course of my lifetime was a lie, I felt that it would be best if I researched the passages dealing with the circumstances surrounding the birth of Cain and Abel thoroughly before declaring the serpent seed doctrine to be untrue. The account of Cain's conception can be found in Genesis chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Linguistically, this verse seems to explain in no uncertain terms that Cain's birth resulted from Adam knowing Eve. But since the serpent seed people refused to acknowledge that this verse is about intercourse, I felt that I had to at least listen to why they might feel this way. The word translated as new is yada, Strong's H3045. Yada is properly translated as new. In other words, this word is not specifically about sexual intimacy, but can be used just as our English word know and new are used. At Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, the word that is used to describe the sex acts between the Nephilim and the daughters of men is bow, Strong's H935, which would be accurately translated as came unto or entered in at this verse. But this word, just like the word yada, is not limited in its use to describing only sexual intimacy. Just a few verses later, at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 20, God tells Noah of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come unto thee, to keep them alive. At this verse, the word bow is rendered as come unto thee. Yada, the word that is translated as new at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1, can be used to describe many things having nothing to do with human reproduction. But there is no denying that it is repeatedly used throughout the Bible as a way of telling us who the biological father was of who. Just a few verses after the account of Cain's conception and birth at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 17, the Bible records the birth of Cain's son Enoch. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. At this verse, the word yada is rendered as made love. Several English translations render this word in this way in both verses that I am discussing. I have no agenda. Hence, I would not choose to render this word in this way, even though I believe that doing so communicates exactly what the word yada means at this verse. Another verse that confirms that the biological father of Cain was Adam is the description of the birth of his brother Seth, who eventually became an ancestor of Jesus. At Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25, we are told, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore another son and called his name Seth, for as she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel because Cain killed him. If we look at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1 again, the word that is translated as and she conceived is watahar, Strong's H2029. This word isn't just using the word and as if it is transitioning into a separate thought. As originally recorded, the word watahar is specifically pointing to Adam's knowing Eve and the cause of Cain's conception. There isn't any room for any alternate understanding of how Cain's conception came about. As originally rendered in ancient Hebrew, Only Adam could be the biological father of Cain. Even though genetic traits such as skin color, blood type, and height are chosen for us, traits such as wickedness and righteousness are often spoken of in the Bible as the result of personal choice. It must be acknowledged that according to the Bible, we all descended from the sons of God and the women built from those sons of God. In other words, even though we all have only one biological father and one biological mother, we all have many thousands of biological ancestors. In effect, each and every one of us has descended from Adam and any other sons of God that happen to have been in the Garden of Eden, including any wicked sons of God. It could be said that we inherited the characteristics of righteousness or wickedness from both. However, it could be argued that like skin color and blood type, we don't get to choose what kind of person we are. And there may in fact be some truth to that, but there is more recorded here that makes that seem unlikely. At 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12, the relationship between Satan and Cain is explained in greater detail. Let us not be like Cain, who belonged to the wicked one and slew his brother. And why slew he him? Because his own works were evil and his brother's works were righteous. According to this verse, it was not a biological inherited character trait that caused Cain to become wicked. It was a choice. The verse does not say that Cain was just like his father Satan, but that he belonged to Satan. According to the Ten Commandments, we are to honor our father and mother. Cain obviously did not kill because he was the biological son of Adam. Cain learned to be a murderer, likely from the only recognized murderer that is spoken of as being alive on the earth at the time, Satan. Obviously, Eve was not the daughter of Satan. She was created by God from one of Adam's ribs, and yet she chose to join Satan in his rebellion against God. Many feel that it would be unfair to judge Eve for her actions, and the Bible agrees somewhat. As a result of her rebellion, she eventually died. So did Adam and all of their children. According to Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, that was their punishment for their sins. The wage that we are paid for sinning is death. Eve was told that if she sinned, she would die. God's word came true when Eve eventually died. Therefore, she has received her punishment in full. But unlike the gods of punishment and reward that are worshipped by those who practice religion, the true God does not falsely claim to be forgiving. According to Acts chapter 24 and verse 15, our God, the true God, really is forgiving. I have the same hope in God that they themselves cherish, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Once I was able to clearly see from the Bible account that the Nephilim were nothing more than humans with a reputation for violence, I had to try to determine if this phrase would be applied to all of mankind or just to those with an exceptional reputation for killing living things. After all, we could all be called Nephilim if all that is required is the killing of plants, animals, fish, birds, people, or trees. In the beginning, Adam was only given permission to eat the fruit and leaves of trees, not the trees themselves. Such a diet would not lead to the death of anything. Many have chosen to live as close to that law as possible by only consuming vegetables. But with the advent of agriculture, even vegetarians are limited by the laws of civilization as given to man by Satan. Agriculture is nothing like what mankind would have eaten in the Garden of Eden. All vegetarian diets cause the destruction of plants, not just the leaves and fruit, but in many cases the entire plant, roots, stems, leaves, and all. Without the destruction of God's forest, agriculture would not be possible. Billions of acres of God's planet have been destroyed in Satan's quest for world domination, and that destruction continues to this day. Plants, animals, birds, fish, trees, and even human beings die every minute of every day due to the process of converting this planet into agricultural projects. Many greedily assist Satan and his demons by fully devoting themselves to the expansion and preservation of his civilization. Even though it is undeniable that the word Nephilim means fellers and that the word fellers simply means murderers, the verse is specifically about a certain type of murderer. Calling these Nephilim the mighty men which were of old, the men of renown, indicates that they stood out and, in fact, unlike common murderers, were admired for the killing that they were involved in. So much so that they were considered to be heroes. In our day, just as in the ancient past, the only murderers that are admired as heroes would be members of the world's armed forces. The Bible does not require that we take a stand against these sons of the serpent. Using nothing more than common sense, anyone can see for themselves that struggling against civilization by involving ourselves in the political process, carnal warfare, or judicial actions has never once had any effect whatsoever on slowing down mankind's destruction of the earth or its inhabitants. We do not want to fall into the same trap that Eve fell into when Satan offered her the opportunity to improve her situation by making herself like a god. God does not require us to attempt to elect leaders that we feel may enact better laws designed to save the forest. God does not expect us to try to figure out which agricultural products are produced in a sustainable manner. God does not even require us to plant a tree. When Adam and Eve were created, they were placed in a garden that had already been planted. And very soon we too will find ourselves in such surroundings. The last thing that we think about as we drift off to sleep every night should somehow relate to how terrible civilization is, or how wonderful life is going to be once civilization is done away with forever. The wicked never think about such things. They are so obsessed with their own selfish desires that they never think about much more than dominating others that do not have the same religious beliefs that they have. People that do not have the same color of skin. People that live on the other side of some imaginary line. Selfish people can't even get along with those who are the same religion, same color, or citizens of the same nation. Very soon, all of the world's military personnel, as well as the mindless, selfish fools that admire them, will be exposed for what they truly are: cowards. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15 puts it this way: "And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and their mighty men, and every bondman and every freeman hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains." Throughout the Bible, stories about family lineage often involve disputes between children by birth and children by adoption. Jesus himself was considered to be a child of Joseph, even though we know for a fact that he was really a child of God. Biologically, we are all children of the sons of God. However, the Bible holds out the promise that we can all one day be adopted as children of God. The Greek word huthesia, Strong's G5206, translates as our English word adoption and occurs 5 times in the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 5 uses the word adoption this way. He predestined us to be adopted through Jesus Christ for Himself, according to His favor and will. Nearly everything that we can learn about Adam, Satan, the Nephilim, Noah, Noah's sons, Abraham, Melchizedek, and Jesus usually relates to lineage. However, since we have all descended from the same God, and since each and every one of us is unique, we cannot logically conclude that everyone who is wicked has the same color of skin, or belongs to the same religion, or lives in the same country, or shares a similar blood type. There are many stories from many cultures involving beings called gods with extraordinary powers. The Bible itself contains many similar stories. Even Jesus exhibited such powers. He was able to heal the sick, raise the dead, miraculously feed thousands of people, and even walk on water. When asked about his extraordinary abilities by a man named Nicodemus, Jesus replied in a way that revealed a sacred secret that the churches have been concealing for thousands of years. I'll be revealing the secret as this series progresses. In fact, before this series concludes, I promise that I will be revealing many sacred secrets. The small amount of time that you will need to invest in watching this series from beginning to end will be well worth it. Events are about to start taking place that are going to require you to make some very important decisions. You don't want to be faced with those decisions unprepared. All of the propaganda being promoted by the empire is poison. No political decision will ever lead to you or anyone else ever acquiring everlasting life. The Bible does not say that God was angry with the bad Nephilim, but pleased with the good Nephilim. It simply says that the Nephilim were ruining His earth with their violence. If you are a member of the military or feel obligated to thank the military personnel of your nation for making you free, you are in great danger of soon being destroyed by God at Armageddon. As Revelation chapter 11 and verse 18 says, God is bringing to ruin those who are ruining the earth. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.